June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy stood thick and unbroken, their silence shattered only by the distant growl of engines. German infantrymen crouched low, eyes fixed on the winding country lanes. For weeks, they had been told the Sherman was fragile, a rolling coffin that burst into flames with the slightest hit. The enemy nicknamed it the Tommy Cooker for a reason. But as the first armored columns pushed through the bocage that morning, something felt different. Lieutenant Karl Ritter adjusted his field glasses. He had seen Shermans before, but these did not die so easily. A Panzerfaust team fired from concealment. Flames licked at the target, yet the tank pressed on, smoke trailing but still advancing. Ritter cursed. The reports from the Eastern Front had promised that American armor was weak, vulnerable. Yet here, in the fields of Normandy, these Shermans refused to ignite. Before we dive deeper into this hidden story of survival, make sure you like this video and subscribe. It helps us uncover more forgotten secrets of history. The infantry around Ritter exchanged nervous glances. Another shot rang out, this time from a concealed 75mm anti-tank gun. The shell slammed into a Sherman's flank, sparks and fragments bursting outward. For a heartbeat, German troops waited for the familiar fireball. None came. The tank halted, then lurched forward again, turret swinging, gun barking in reply. Within moments, the anti-tank nest was silenced. "What in God's name are these things made of?" a soldier muttered. Ritter had no answer. What he was witnessing contradicted months of doctrine drilled into every German unit. Hit a Sherman once, and it would light up like dry tinder. But on this morning, the battlefield told a different story. By noon, Ritter had watched 4 Shermans take punishing blows. None erupted the way they were supposed to. One limped back toward Allied lines, another smoked heavily, yet kept firing. For the Germans, confusion deepened. Something inside these machines had changed, and that secret would alter the balance of the battlefield far more than they realized. Long before the hedgerows of Normandy, the Sherman carried a grim reputation among its own crews. In North Africa, 1942, the first clashes with German panzers exposed a flaw so deadly it haunted Allied tankers. The Sherman burned too easily. Its design placed ammunition racks along the hull sides, unprotected and dangerously close to the crew. When a German shell punched through the armor, the propellant charges inside often ignited, flooding the compartment with fire. Survivors recalled how the tank became an oven within seconds. Some never even had time to open the hatches. The British, forced to use large numbers of Shermans in desert battles, coined the cruel nickname Tommy Cooker. The statistics painted a terrifying picture. Field studies in Tunisia showed that 6 out of 10 Shermans struck by enemy fire erupted in flames. Crews began carrying sidearms, not for the enemy, but for themselves, grim insurance against being trapped in a burning steel coffin. The morale effect was devastating. A tank crew stepping into their vehicle often wondered if they had climbed into their own funeral pyre. By 1943, letters and reports flooded back to Washington and Detroit. Commanders like General Jacob Devers warned the Ordnance Department that unless the fire hazard was solved, the Sherman would remain a liability. Soldiers could not be asked to fight with machines they believed were death traps. Behind the scenes, American engineers and military scientists debated furiously. Some argued for thicker armor or better guns, but those were long-term projects. What crews demanded was survival. They needed insurance against the fire that so often consumed their brothers. The problem was clear: the ammunition storage method. If the propellant could be isolated or cooled, the Sherman's chances of survival would rise dramatically. But could such a fix be implemented quickly, across thousands of tanks already rolling off the production lines? The urgency of the battlefield forced innovation. Army ordnance experts, along with engineers at the Detroit Tank Arsenal, began experimenting with radical new approaches. Their breakthrough would not involve thicker armor or revolutionary weapons. Instead, it would come from a simple but ingenious idea: change the way shells were stored inside the tank. And that subtle innovation, invisible to the enemy, would quietly rewrite the Sherman's fate. By early 1944, the quest to stop the Sherman's lethal blazes had become an ordnance imperative. Engineers at Detroit's tank plants and Army research teams dissected wrecks and recreated penetration scenarios. Answers did not arrive in thicker armor or bigger guns, but in a pragmatic, almost humble reimagining of internal storage. Dr. Richard Patterson, tasked with analyzing catastrophic losses, argued that the problem lay not outside the hull, but inside it, propellant igniting when exposed. If the ammunition surroundings could be altered, ignition might be prevented. A proposal emerged that sounded simple and odd: wrap the magazines in liquid. Marine Colonel David Chen, drawing on observations from the Pacific, suggested water-filled jackets around the racks. Water's ability to absorb heat and dampen explosive energy made it a natural shield. Prototypes were constructed and shipped to the Ardennes proving grounds for live fire evaluation. Captain William Foster supervised the tests. Instrumented hulls faced captured German anti-tank guns in controlled trials. The comparisons were stark. Tanks with water-jacketed stowage saw a dramatic fall in ammunition fires compared to dry racks. Where earlier designs often erupted, the wet system held temperatures down and prevented propellant from cooking off. Implementing the fix across production lines required adjustments. Water jackets altered internal geometry, added weight, and demanded new sealing and maintenance routines. Factory foremen and ordnance officials negotiated revised assembly steps. Boilermakers and armorers worked alongside riveters to fit the jackets. Some manufacturers warned of slower output and higher costs, but ordnance officers emphasized crew survival. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, informed by Aberdeen's data and field reports, approved immediate incorporation of wet stowage into tanks bound for Europe. Secrecy was strict. Commanders feared that publicizing the change would give the enemy a clue to adapt tactics. Quietly, beginning in March 1944, production models rolled out with their protective water barrier concealed beneath conventional plating. It was an unglamorous remedy, neither flashy nor weaponized, but its effect would be profound. On the receiving end of enemy penetrations, crews in wet stowage Shermans would survive hits that previously proved fatal. Aberdeen S instruments recorded ammunition fires falling from around 60% in earlier models to below 20% in water-jacketed prototypes, a reduction that promised to save hundreds of lives once those tanks reached combat. Summer 1944. German field headquarters filled with contradictory dispatches. Anti-tank crews along the Normandy lanes were sending messages that made little sense. They claimed direct hits against American Shermans that should have produced firestorms, yet many of the targets rolled away, smoldering but intact. General Heinz Guderian, reviewing frontline reports, grew impatient. For years, Wehrmacht doctrine had treated the Sherman as a flammable target. Propaganda circulated photographs of blazing Allied tanks, reinforcing morale. Now, seasoned officers wrote that the familiar inferno was absent. A single shell, even two, no longer guaranteed ignition. Major Klaus Richter compiled field notes from panzer divisions retreating from Caen. His summary was troubling. Crews were observing stubborn survivability in Sherman units, with penetrations less often leading to catastrophic fires. The intelligence section suspected thicker plating or changes in fuel composition. No one guessed at water-jacketed racks hidden deep inside the hull. Efforts to capture intact wrecks failed. Air power and artillery usually reduced knocked-out vehicles to hulks before German recovery teams could examine them. One officer wrote bitterly that Allied fighter bombers destroyed more evidence than any security classification. The mystery endured, and frustration seeped into tactical conferences. Meanwhile, propaganda officers hesitated. They could not explain why German gunners were failing to produce the familiar spectacle of burning Shermans. Some soldiers began whispering that the Americans had conjured Geisterpanzer, ghost tanks immune to fire. In truth, the explanation was far less dramatic, but no less decisive. The gap between expectation and reality eroded confidence. Panzerjäger units that once approached battles with assurance now hesitated. If the Sherman no longer burned reliably, then ammunition expenditure would climb, ambushes would require more guns, and withdrawal would come sooner. Small shifts in perception carried outsized effects on battlefield psychology. Intercepted Allied communications gave no answers. Ciphered reports spoke of new stowage arrangements, but without detail. German intelligence analysts, overwhelmed by the torrent of Allied material after D-Day, pushed the Sherman question down their priority lists. They underestimated how a subtle, invisible alteration could reshape engagements. By the autumn battles around the Siegfried Line, doubts had hardened into resignation. The old axiom, "one hit and the Sherman cooks," was no longer reliable. The Wehrmacht faced an opponent whose tanks refused to conform to expectations, and the mystery gnawed at commanders already stretched thin. For the men who fought inside Shermans, the difference was more than mechanical. It was psychological. Tank crews had lived for years with the dread that a single hit would transform their machine into a furnace. Veterans from Tunisia and Sicily told newcomers chilling stories of friends lost in seconds. The wet storage system, though invisible to the eye, began to ease that constant fear. Sergeant Frank Delaney of the 3rd Armored Division recalled his first days in France. Before, he said, climbing into a Sherman felt like strapping yourself to a powder keg. By August 1944, his crew received a new model equipped with water-jacketed racks. The officers offered no ceremony, only a brief technical note in the manual. But word spread quickly among the men. These ones don't blow so easy. In early engagements outside St. Lo, Delaney's tank absorbed a hit from a German Pak-40. The shell punched through the side, shrapnel rattling, but the interior stayed dark, not aflame. The crew returned fire, destroyed the gun, and drove the damaged Sherman back to maintenance. That night, Delaney wrote home, telling his wife that for the first time he believed the odds favored survival. Across units, similar stories multiplied. Corporal James Walsh from Patton S. 3rd Army described watching a companion tank struck twice by Panzer fire. Instead of bursting apart, it belched smoke, and the crew escaped with burns and shock, but alive. The difference, Walsh said later, was that we could fight again tomorrow. Training officers noticed the effect almost immediately. Recruits climbed into their vehicles with less hesitation. Briefings emphasized that the enemy's old nickname no longer applied. The term Ronson, once bitterly used by British crews, faded from conversation. Confidence returned, and with it came bolder tactics. Tank commanders pressed forward more aggressively, knowing that a lucky hit did not automatically spell death. Infantry soldiers, watching Sherman survive strikes, began to trust their armored partners more deeply. The cooperative spirit of combined arms strengthened, not because of new guns or engines, but because of a hidden layer of water surrounding shells. Morale, once fragile, now solidified. Crews still feared enemy fire, but the nightmare of instant cremation receded. In its place grew determination. Wet stowage was more than engineering. It was reassurance, steel reinforced by hope. By autumn 1944, the quiet revolution inside the Sherman began reshaping battlefield practice. The wet storage system gave tankers not only a higher chance of survival, but also the nerve to execute maneuvers once deemed reckless. Where caution had previously dictated slow, deliberate advances, armored commanders now encouraged speed and pressure. General George S. Patton, never shy about aggressive doctrine, seized on the newfound resilience. Reports from his 3rd Army praised Shermans that endured multiple hits and kept rolling. Patton instructed battalion leaders to press the enemy without pause, arguing that even a damaged Sherman often remained serviceable long enough to smash through defensive lines. Field evidence supported his push. In the Lorraine campaign, American columns advanced against entrenched German positions bristling with 75mm and 88mm guns. Crews noted that penetrations no longer meant certain annihilation. Instead of halting after first contact, armored spearheads maintained momentum, overwhelming gun lines with volume and persistence. Lieutenant Harold Gibson of the 4th Armored Division described one such charge. His unit stormed across open ground toward a ridge, fully expecting casualties. Anti-tank shells slammed into the column. 2 Shermans smoked heavily, but stayed mobile long enough to crest the ridge and silence the German position. Gibson later reflected, "We fought like hammers instead of glass." This shift rippled through combined arms tactics. Infantry advanced with greater confidence, shielded by armor that did not vanish in flames at the first strike. Artillery coordination improved, as tanks could hold exposed ground longer. Air controllers, observing Shermans withstand punishment, directed fighter bombers to exploit breakthroughs rather than rescue shattered units. For German defenders, the difference was stark. In Normandy, they had relied on ambushes, confident that a handful of guns could halt columns with fireballs. By late 1944, those same tactics faltered. Ambushes slowed, but no longer destroyed American thrusts. Even knocked-out Shermans often absorbed resources. Enemy crews had to fire multiple times, buying precious minutes for U.S. reinforcements to arrive. Doctrinal manuals were updated to reflect the transformation. Training pamphlets circulated among replacement crews, stressing that survivability had improved. The message was clear. The Sherman was no longer a coffin on tracks, but a weapon to be driven hard and fearlessly. Innovation hidden beneath armor had altered the rhythm of entire campaigns. What began as a technical adjustment had blossomed into a tactical renaissance. As 1944 dragged into its bitter winter, whispers spread across German units at the front. Soldiers who once mocked the Sherman as a predictable fire trap now spoke of it with unease. Accounts circulated of tanks that soaked up multiple hits, yet stubbornly refused to ignite. In dugouts and barracks, men muttered that the Americans had discovered some hidden sorcery. Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger, a veteran gunner on the Eastern Front now redeployed to the West, remembered being stunned when his crew fired 3 times into a single Sherman outside Aachen. Each strike penetrated. Smoke poured out, but no catastrophic blaze followed. "It should have been finished," he recorded later, "but it kept moving. We doubted our eyes." Such experiences eroded confidence. For years, German gunners measured success by the sight of a burning wreck. Fire was proof. Fire was morale. Without it, doubts festered. Crews began overfiring, spending scarce ammunition in frustration, straining supply lines already weakened by Allied bombing. Commanders recognized the psychological slide. Briefings reminded troops that the Sherman was still vulnerable, urging them to aim for the flanks or close at shorter ranges. But the absence of flames gnawed at belief. One panzer officer described it bluntly. "The battlefield felt different. Our men lost faith that their weapons worked as promised." Propaganda officers faced a dilemma. Posters and newsreels had long shown blazing Shermans as symbols of German superiority. Now those images rang hollow. Soldiers who faced the new models scoffed at official claims. Disillusionment deepened, another crack in the Wehrmacht's already fraying morale. In foxholes across the Ardennes, tank hunting squads hesitated. If the Sherman no longer burst apart, was charging with a Panzerfaust still worth near certain death? Younger troops, less seasoned, sometimes faltered, failing to spring ambushes. Each hesitation allowed Allied armor to press forward with fewer losses. The irony was sharp. The Americans had not introduced a monstrous new superweapon, but rather a subtle tweak inside an old design. Yet that quiet change warped the perception of thousands of German soldiers. What once inspired derision now stirred unease. On battlefields, where certainty had once emboldened defenders, uncertainty now ruled. The Sherman's secret had become a weapon of the mind, as much as of steel. The full measure of the Sherman's hidden improvement emerged in the crucible of actual combat. In September 1944, during the push through Lorraine, American columns encountered determined German resistance armed with Park 40s and Panther tanks. Lieutenant Charles Rains of the 37th Tank Battalion led his platoon against dug-in anti-tank guns. 2 of his Shermans were hit squarely, shells piercing their sides. Smoke billowed, but neither erupted. Crews bailed out, shaken yet alive, while the rest of the formation pressed forward to crush the position. In after-action notes, Rains credited the new storage arrangements for sparing his men. Further north, at Aachen, German defenders deployed 80 mm cannons along choke points. Captain Edward Harris recalled how one Sherman in his company absorbed multiple 88 strikes before finally halting. In previous years, such hits would have guaranteed a blazing wreck. This time, the stricken tank merely smoked, its crew scrambling free. The psychological lift was immense. Watching comrades escape turned dread into determination. Perhaps the clearest test came during the Battle of the Bulge. In the snowy forests of Ardennes, panzer divisions hurled everything they had at American armor. Sergeant Louis Parker's Sherman was struck by a Panther round near Bastogne. The shell detonated inside the hull, but the wet storage did its work. The water jackets prevented ammunition from cooking off. Parker and his crew evacuated, shaken but alive. Their survival meant they could be reassigned to fresh tanks within days, preserving combat strength at a moment when every crew counted. German interrogations of captured Americans confirmed the shift. Prisoners spoke candidly about reduced fire casualties, reinforcing the enemy's growing suspicion that something fundamental had changed. Yet without access to intact vehicles, German analysts could not pinpoint the secret. Their battlefield experience remained a puzzle. Familiar tactics no longer produced familiar results. Historians later quantified what veterans had sensed. Data collected by U.S. Army Ordnance showed catastrophic fire losses fell from roughly 60% in older Shermans to less than 20% in wet stowage models. Each percentage point represented dozens of crews who lived to fight another day. These case studies illustrated a truth often overlooked in warfare. Survival itself is a weapon. By keeping crews alive, the Sherman's hidden innovation preserved experience, steadied morale, and sustained pressure. On the battlefield, that mattered as much as any new gun or engine. By late 1944, the strategic ripple effects of wet ammunition storage were undeniable. Tank divisions no longer suffered catastrophic attrition of trained crews. Before the change, commanders constantly faced the grim arithmetic of replacement. Veterans lost in fiery deaths meant raw recruits rushed forward, often with minimal preparation. With wet storage, the cycle shifted. Survivors could be reassigned, retrained, and returned, giving armored units a stability they had lacked in earlier years. General George S. Patton remarked in a December 1944 briefing that his divisions were keeping their nerve longer, a subtle but critical observation. He was not merely praising bravery. He was noting that his men no longer expected instant death when their tank was hit. This altered how crews fought. Instead of holding back, they pushed through ambushes, executed flanking maneuvers, and closed with the enemy, confident their odds of survival were higher. On the German side, the shift carried grim implications. Wehrmacht staff reports from January 1945 described how enemy armor seems harder to neutralize decisively. German gunners were still scoring hits, but the battlefield effect was muted. Tanks that should have been blazing markers of destruction were instead recoverable assets, sometimes towed back for repair and rejoining the fight within weeks. For an army fighting a war of attrition, this imbalance in materiel and manpower was devastating. Strategically, wet stowage contributed to the U.S. Army's ability to maintain relentless momentum. The Normandy breakout, the dash across France, and the counter-offensive during the Ardennes all benefited from divisions that retained a core of experienced crews. Every Sherman saved by this innovation meant a crew that could continue to contribute to combined arms coordination, intelligence sharing, and tactical adaptation. In warfare, continuity of knowledge inside a platoon often outweighed technical specifications on paper. The consequences stretched beyond 1945. In the immediate post-war period, U.S. Ordnance analysts compiled detailed reports on the success of wet ammunition storage, influencing future tank designs like the M26 Pershing and later Cold War vehicles. NATO allies adopted similar principles, ensuring that crew survivability remained a central feature of Western armored doctrine. What began as a quiet engineering fix had grown into a strategic advantage, shaping the tempo of campaigns and the resilience of entire armies. The Sherman, once derided as a death trap, was evolving into a symbol of survivability, a shift that left its mark on both history and the psychology of mechanized warfare. When the last guns of World War II fell silent, the reputation of the Sherman tank was far more complex than the death trap label often attached to it in soldiers' lore. For those who fought inside its steel walls, the memory of fire was a specter that haunted every mission. Yet by war's end, thousands of crews owed their survival to the quiet, almost invisible safeguard of wet ammunition storage. It did not make the Sherman invincible. It did something more profound. It gave its crews a fighting chance. Historians evaluating the Western Front often weigh armor thickness, gun penetration, and mechanical reliability. But in oral histories and after-action reports, another pattern emerges: survival stories. Men who crawled out of smoking hulls at Lorraine, Aachen, and Bastogne later became instructors, unit leaders, and veterans who lived to tell future generations about the war. Their existence itself is a testimony to the life-preserving value of the innovation. For Germany, the legacy was one of frustration. Its tank aces, accustomed to watching targets explode, now faced a foe that refused to die as expected. This subtle shift weakened not only tactical outcomes, but also the confidence of those fighting on Hitler's side. An adversary that kept surviving became in time an adversary that kept winning. In the decades that followed, the lesson of wet stowage became part of the broader doctrine of armored warfare. Crew protection matters as much as firepower. The United States and its allies carried this forward into the Cold War, ensuring that survivability was never an afterthought. From the M48 Patton to the M1 Abrams, the lineage of design reflects this truth. Armor must not only kill, it must also save. The Sherman's story, therefore, is not one of perfection, but of adaptation. A tank criticized for its shortcomings transformed, through ingenuity, into a vehicle that preserved lives and prolonged effectiveness on the battlefield. Its legacy is not only written in steel and statistics, but also in the living memory of men who came home. As we look back, the hidden water jackets inside a Sherman may seem like a small detail. Yet in the brutal reality of war, that detail meant the difference between a burned-out wreck with a lost crew and a smoking survivor with men ready to fight another day. Sometimes history is shaped not by grand designs, but by the smallest innovations that keep hope alive under fire.